Welcome everyone to publishing session, today's last spARO event it is. And my name is Jarnail Singh. I got introduced to this exciting auditory research field in 2017 when I joined as postdoctoral fellow in Dr. Brandon Cox's laboratory at SAU School of Medicine. My research is focused on the role of transcription factor PAF4F3 in regulation of hair cell survival in mouse model. In mouse cochlea, we are also investigating the possible role this transcription factor might play in the protection of hair cells from noise-induced damage in mice. Let me introduce our speakers we have for this session today. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Jenny Stone, who is a research professor in otolaryngology at the University of Washington. Jenny did her graduate training in anatomy and neurobiology at Boston University with Doug Cottines, studying hair cell regeneration in birds. She performed her postdoctoral training with Ed Rubel at the University of Washington on a similar topic, and then transitioned to faculty in 1998, where she uses cellular and molecular approaches to study hair cell development and regeneration, mostly in mice. Jenny is currently the director of research in her department, and she manages a T32 research training grant for otolaryngology residents. Her research program has been supported by the NIH for nearly 25 years, and she has published her work as research articles and reviews in a wide range of journals. And she has written several book chapters as well. Jenny has provided research training to postdoctoral fellows, graduate students, and undergrads. Thank you, Jenny, for joining us to mentor this session.
Thank you, Jarnail.
Another speaker we have today with us for mentoring this session is Dr. Andy Groves. Andy Groves was born in London and studied natural sciences at the University of Cambridge. He did his PhD at the Ludwig Institute for Cancer Research at the University College London, where he studied the early development of the nervous system. Then he moved to California for postdoctoral training at the California Institute of Technology. And it was there that he changed his research focus to study the development and regeneration of inner ear. He was a section chief at the House Ear Institute in Los Angeles between 1999 and 2008. Dr. Groves was recruited to Baylor College of Medicine in summer of 2008, where he is now the Vivian L. Smith Professor in the departments of neuroscience and molecular and human genetics. And he is also the director of graduate program in development, disease models, and therapeutics. He is currently editor for developmental biology, developmental dynamics, and frontiers in cellular neurosciences. Thank you, Andy, for joining us to mentor this session. Now, I will request our speakers to share their experience in publishing their research findings and how did it help them excel and move forward in their career journey. I would also request attendees to please feel free to post questions in the chat box that I will take one by one to get these questions answered. Thank you.
All right, thank you. It's great to see everybody. Nice to be here today for this session. I really appreciate what spARO is doing in these mentoring sessions. And I see that there are, in addition to me and Andy, a couple other faculty on the call, and I would like to encourage them too to share their ideas around publications and their experiences. What has my experience been? Well, you know, it's varied throughout my training, and you know, it was initially a big mystery. I got a lot of support through my mentors in you know how to do it, and I have a fairly, through my postdoctoral graduate training, I've been very, very lucky to have mentors who've worked closely and very honestly with me and how to write papers, how to get them published, how to go through the challenges of reviews and addressing reviews in a way that's effective. And it continues to be tough. I think publishing is a challenge to all of us. We have a lot of different pressures on us. Some, we want to publish great papers, but we want to do it in a timely way. We want to, impress our peers, but we also feel obligated to get our papers out quickly and accessible to the public. Because that's an obligation we have to our funding agencies. So there's a lot of different pressures. Other people are, pressed by time or by impact factor or other things. So I'm constantly learning, but I feel I've gained a lot of skills that I hope I can share with you today.
So what does it take to develop like effective writing skills?
Maybe we should let Andy present his perspective too.
Okay.
Well, I can actually, that's Jamal's question is actually a good transition. So I just wanted to say a few things because this is mostly for trainees here today. I wanted to say a few things about publishing as a training activity. So I direct a grad program at Baylor, and a couple of years ago, our graduate school decided that we would make it a requirement to publish a first author paper before you could get your PhD here at Baylor. And that was, it was quite I'm not going to say it was a controversial decision, but it promoted a lot of discussion among the faculty and the students as well. And I think one of the reasons in the end we came down on requiring it is that the act of publication, the process of publication, is a really important training activity for students and postdocs. And regardless of where you send the paper or which journal it gets published in, I think as trainees, working with your mentor and working with your collaborators to put a paper together, to write it, to help get the figures together, to do, grunt work like get the references in shape, then to send the paper out to respond to the reviewers and, rebut or address their concerns, and then shepherd the paper towards publication. I think that is a valuable training experience, regardless of really which journal you send it to. And so as trainees, many mentors really heavily involve their trainees in all aspects of the publication process. Some do not. And I would just, start off by saying to all of you, I think publishing, regardless of where you send your paper, is a valuable training exercise. And it's really important to be involved in it from as early in your career as possible, from the PhD or even pre-PhD level onwards. Now, maybe to then segue into Jamal's point about writing, it is obviously, someone like me who was born in Britain, grew up an English speaker, I have an obvious built-in advantage, that English is my first language. But I think many people, even native English speakers, struggle to write clearly. And I think increasingly, universities and research institutes are investing in writing workshops, sort of just science presentation workshops. There are a whole bunch of online resources that you can be pointed to as well. And I wish I had had a lot of those resources available to me when I was a grad student, starting to write my first papers and then write my PhD thesis. And I know many people who have found when they attend a good writing class, ideally one that isn't just a single seminar, but takes place over a period of days or periodically over a period of months, that can be transformative in your ability to write well. So, even though I started off with some built-in advantages, I think everyone can benefit from, writing workshops just in terms of getting your ideas across. You know, that's the hardest thing. What do you want to say in this paragraph? And actually in a lot of thesis committee meetings where students are presenting their papers, or their ideas for papers, I end up by cutting to the chase by saying to them, tell me what the title of the paper is going to be. And that forces them to really think about, you know, what it is what it is they want to say. If you know what the title is, then a lot of what follows becomes easier.
Thank you, Dr. Andy. And in addition to the writing workshop, like what role your peers or mentor could play in developing this skill?
Jenny, do you want to talk about Ed's approach to writing? The sign on his office door.
What is that? Which one are you thinking of?
Wasn't it, don't bring me a draft of a paper until it's perfect?
Quite tongue-in-cheek. Yeah, I mean, can you repeat the question again, Jarnell? Sorry.
So like what role your peers or mentors could play in developing this skill? Like someone has attended workshops as well, and like you have your draft, and then like your peers can go through that and like improve your language, or they might say like, hey, this is not clear to me, what you want to try to say here, or something like that.
I see. Yeah, I think writing a paper, getting it to publishing it's a multi-layered process, right? I mean, ultimately, publishing starts when you do the experimental design, because you know, if you're really thinking critically about a paper or a study and what it's going to look like at the end, you want to really think very carefully at the beginning about how you design it. And so I think, you know, at the University of Washington, we have a lot of group meetings where we get together and discuss ideas. We discuss what we think the paper will look like. We share the progress all the way through, as I'm sure many of you do in your lab meetings as well. And I take those questions and criticisms to heart, and you know, try to always think about how to integrate them into the paper, because if they're coming up at the early stages or the intermediate stages, these are going to be the things I think often the reviewers are going to focus on. And so I think that presenting your ideas, presenting your data, your interpretations of your data, and the way in which you want to present those data in terms of figures and graphs to your colleagues, and particularly your senior colleagues, as frequently as possible is very, very helpful. And you know, attending to the feedback is important, because you're always, like Andy sort of alluded to, constantly reframing what those questions are that your paper is addressing, and that process helps you a lot. So, and co-authors and co-collaborators are probably the most important people to bounce your ideas and thoughts of. So we're you know, it's seek advice as frequently as possible.
Yeah, I think just the aspect of making decisions about what to include in a paper can promote a lot of soul searching, particularly on the part of trainees. So trainees are working really hard. They're producing data all the time. And there can be a tendency, you know, on the first drafts of papers or the first drafts of figures to put as much data in as possible. It's sort of, you know, you've been working for 18 months on this project, and so everything from day one through to, you know, the present day has to go in the paper. And a lot of people, it's like, I've worked really hard on this, I don't want to lose that, or, you know, even relegate it to the supplementary data. And I think going back to, you know, what I was saying about what do you want the title of the paper to be, I think working with your collaborators and your mentor early on to think about what the data is telling you and the message you want to get across can be really important. And you can't really do very much writing and sort of arranging stuff until you have a reasonably clear idea of at least what the beginning of the paper is going to look like. You know, obviously many papers are work in progress, and works in progress, and they can change as the final experiments are done, and maybe the end of the paper goes in a different direction. But I think that, you know, making quite, you know, ruthless strategic decisions about what to include and what to exclude is also an important thing to start doing even before you start typing.
Yeah, and I think being the driver of those meetings too, to discuss these sorts of questions with your mentor and with your co-authors is really important as well. Sometimes I find as a PI, I'm driving these things myself because I'm feeling the pressure to get things published, or, you know, I want to make sure the progress is being made. But I also, when I was a trainee, I also did that. I was, you know, trying to shepherd the paper through. And I found that the best way to do that was to have frequent meetings and to discuss these things that Andy's talking about. You know, oh, I have a new figure, let me share it with you. And how does this fit into the current paper as we're perceiving it? And what new questions does it raise that we have to address right now? So for instance, do we have to validate some of our assumptions? You know, do we need a new set of controls? Do we need to add more animals to really understand what's happening? So my main point here is just to feel comfortable in driving your team, so to speak, your co-authors, in some cases your mentor, to attend to it, to be actively attending to it.
Right. And people are struggle to choose like appropriate journal to publish their research findings. Like sometimes they have already in their mind, oh, I'm going to publish my finding in this particular journal, and they work in that direction. Or sometimes they have the data and analyze the data and have the draft, and then they start looking for like which journal suits best for this particular article.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think I think a lot of that answer to your question depends on what sort of pressures you feel as an author and what sort of obligations and hopes you have for your paper. You know, I think in some institutions, you know, there's a lot of pressure to apply to a top journal to get your paper published in a top journal. And that works if it's a fairly innovative study, and also I would say comprehensive in a sense that it's not only just reporting a finding, but looking at either a mechanism of that finding or a functional consequence of it, right? So we don't all have papers that fit into that mode. And oftentimes I find the high level journals, the papers are more abbreviated. That I actually prefer not to publish in them. I prefer to publish papers that reach my peers more. That's more of a priority to me than an impact factor. So there's also the issue of timeliness. So in some cases, you may need to get a paper out fairly quickly, and that's going to dictate the type of paper where you submit to, right? The journal you submit to. Considering readership, so who is your audience, I think is very important as well. You know, I think a lot of us are in this community. We're going to stay in this community, so it's great to appeal to this community, to connect to this community, and rather than publishing in more general journals, to publish in specialized journals, so we become well known with our colleagues and our peers who study the same field. I think more important than where you publish to me is that you publish in a timely manner, but I'll defer to Andy because he probably has his own perspectives on things to consider when you're trying to choose a journal.
Sorry, you would have thought after 2 years of Zooming, I would learn to unmute myself in a timely way. So I think Jenny makes a lot of good points there. I think firstly, papers come in different flavors. You can have methods papers, techniques papers. You can have papers introducing or characterizing a new tool that you hope your colleagues are going to use, whether that may be a genetically modified mice or a technique to do something in a new way or to analyze data in a new way. Those are really important. The foundation of our field historically has been not just on experimental studies, but also, if you like, on normative studies. So understanding what are the properties of the inner ear that we work on, the composition of its different cell types, their patterns of innervation, and so on. So there is often a tendency now to denigrate what are called sort of, I don't know, archival or descriptive studies. And I think often if you read people's papers, that you find that some of the papers that get cited again and again are these papers back from when the field was maybe smaller, but people were doing really, really important work characterizing the system that we all work on now. So I think there is a tendency to think of every paper as being a sort of, we're gonna do a bunch of experiments, propose a very radical hypothesis, and then we're gonna, present the data that's gonna confirm this hypothesis. Not every paper is like that. In terms of Jenny's point about steady publication, I think that's really, really important. And I'm addressing this to everyone, but more so right now to maybe the postdocs and junior faculty here. So I've served on our college's tenure committee for, I think, 8 or 9 years now. And I think one of the things that's most important for faculty development is to publish consistently. So, lots of faculty come in and they think they have to, make it big with a high impact paper. And in some cases, they may spend 5 or 6 years trying to do that as their tenure clock is ticking and things, maybe they were awarded a grant early and that grant money is now being spent and they're thinking about, they're trying to renew it. I think that is a very high risk strategy. And what I counsel junior faculty in my institution always is, once you start your lab, start getting points on the board and show that you can do the job you were hired to do, which is publish and disseminate high quality research. And it doesn't have to be, high impact all the time. Just be consistent. And certainly at my institution, if young faculty publish consistency, they don't need to publish in the top, most fashionable journals. If they publish consistently and get some grants, then they will be very favorably positioned for tenure, because the act of publishing consistently gives you a national reputation, right? You can take your stories, for example, to ARO every year. You can get, you can be seen by your peers to be producing, and it is your peers who ultimately, when you come up for promotion, who are going to be writing letters of support for you or letters of reference for you. So I think that kind of consistent publishing is really, really important, and I'm glad that Jenny brought it up.
Thank you so much. And what role does impact factor play, or does it have any significance in, like, if someone has consistently published 3 articles in small journals, like less impact factor, then like another person publishes just one particular article in like high impact, and if both of them are trying to transition to independent research faculty and they are applying for grants, like how does it impact their journey?
Oh, that's a tough one, and there's no single answer for that, because I think in some departments and in some institutions, impact factor is very important. My own personal experience has been at the University of Washington that impact factor is considered very little in promotion from assistant to associate, and from associate to professor. I've also had a similar experience in my study section, AUD study section experiences, that impact factor is just not even considered, like the numerical aspect. What is considered is, that it's a peer-reviewed, excellent journal, right? I mean, that it's a journal that is respected by our peers, that the paper, the quality of the work is good, and that it makes a critical contribution to the field, right? So I'm also not a tenure track faculty, and so I haven't had to worry about impact factor. I'm a weird case, so I like to hear, in other words, my job security is only based on whether I can get funding, in essence. So I want to pass this to Andy too, because he has a different hat he wears in a sense, and also different experiences. So I'm curious what he thinks.
So I think impact factor / the reputation of the journal, because honestly, it's impossible to keep track of impact factors now.
Yeah.
Let's be honest, people use it as a placeholder for quality when they can't be bothered to read the paper itself. And unfortunately, you see this a lot when people discuss papers. Oh, it got into journal X, so therefore it must be good.
Yeah.
And you sadly see this on search committees and other things. There is a discussion of this. And, you know, it's a human thing. It's not just in science, we want placeholders to value things, right? So, you know, if X is rated by Y, then it means X is really good. And it short circuits a critical discussion of, you know, what that thing is really about. Something that is really interesting, and I've been encouraging people in my lab to do this, is to play the bioarchive game, okay? So there are lots and lots of papers on bioarchive, you know, it can be interesting to, you know, have a regular search or like an email set of search terms that are delivered to you from bioarchive, to play the game of looking at a paper, reading it, and then guessing where in 6 months will that paper appear, or will it appear at all. And I think what bioarchive forces people to do is to consider the merits of a paper independently of impact factor or journal, because it hasn't been published yet. And it can be interesting to see where things go. But I think it's also an interesting exercise for everyone to evaluate papers without knowing their impact factor. And I would really recommend people do that from time to time. Just, you know, look at particular papers, and don't, I know bioarchive, you know, like science Twitter will promote the next top paper coming out on bioarchive. Ignore all of that. Just, you know, get regular updates from the journal and follow papers and see where they go. And it can be really interesting to see what happens. And I sometimes have this with graduate students at our institution, where they or their mentor really want their thesis paper to be published in a high impact journal. And sometimes they can go through, you know, months or even years of torment trying to get, you know, that big paper. And something that we say to them sometimes is, look, if that paper is published, you know, in journal A versus much higher impact, you know, journal B, it's going to be the same paper, right? The data isn't changing. And I think something that a mistake we all make is we look at the journal, we look at the impact factor rather than reading the actual paper. Now, you know, I know that everyone wants their, you know, we all want that that seal of approval, but I think it's important sometimes to ask what that seal really means, and whether sometimes the, you know, the heartbreak that people go through to get that, or the delay in people's career, is really worth it.
Yeah, I'll just add, you know, think about what your go-to paper is, right? I can see Anna's on the call, and I read her 2005 paper a lot. I love that paper. you know, and I'm thinking it's a JCM paper, but I'm not totally sure. Like, but to me, that might as well be a science paper because it's been that useful to me, right? It has had a huge impact on my understanding. So think about your go-to papers and ask where they're published. It's probably where you want to read. It's probably where you want to submit.
Yeah, I think an important thing to think about when you're working on your paper is, you know, that it should be a contribution. And will this paper still be around in 10 years? Will people still cite it in 10 years? Have you done a good job, you know? And yeah, it doesn't matter where it goes, journal neurophysiology for an anatomical paper, or, you know, doesn't really matter.
I think one of the distinctions in journals that it's important not to underestimate is whether the journal is run by people who are sort of active scientists versus people who are no longer active scientists and are working for more professional publishing companies. So, you know, papers, journals like JARO, Journal of Neuroscience, are run, their editors are scientists. They are active scientists who can read the papers, understand their impact, understand the challenges that scientists have in getting them published, and do their best to apply reasonable, rigorous standards for what the data should look like and whether it deserves to be in that journal. And my personal experience has been working with what I'm going to call academic editors has been much more rewarding and helpful and in the long term productive than working with other journals where the people who are making decisions about the quality of the paper are not actually doing science anymore. They're just going to scientific meetings and reading science Twitter and doing stuff like that. And I don't think my experience is unique. I think that having working scientists monitor and shepherd your paper through towards publication will result in a much more enjoyable experience and a much more fair experience too.
Yeah, and I think following up on that, just as a general concept, I think it's really important to remember that your reviewers and your editors want this paper to be published. You know, they want the paper to be a good paper. They want to help you through making it as good as it can be, and they want to publish your paper. They're your colleagues. They're your support system. And so, you know, it's very easy, and this happens to me every single time I get a review. I always have this sort of immediate defensive reaction of like, what do you mean you didn't love it? What, there are 2 pages of things I need to attend to? But it's super important to step back from that and realize that this group of people is working very hard to help you create the paper that they can publish. And so, you know, keep that perspective in mind, and
I think
you can
also
learn a lot. Let me just add one more thing before I forget. You can learn a lot from your reviewers and your editor. I had an experience in a paper I published recently where I was, you know, I happened to know the editor. So I gave him a call and I said, you know, would you have a few minutes to give me some feedback on how you think this paper missed the mark because it wasn't accepted? And this was at General Neuroscience. And I spent 20 minutes on the phone with him, and he very clearly laid out the problems. And when he was saying them, he was right. Like, I completely agree with him. I'd really messed up on something. I hadn't targeted the readership, the audience of the journal. But I was mainly just so impressed with the partnership that this editor provided to me. And as Andy was saying, I learned a lot from him because he is a current scientist. You know, he is active. And he had deep insights into this. And so yeah, that's a very important choice.
I think that's really important. I think academic editors are much more likely to involve themselves in discussion of the scientific merits of the paper. Whereas what I would call professional editors, what they tend to do is defer to the reviewers. So you can have conversations, well, reviewer A thinks you need to do A, B, C, and D. So why don't you do A, B, C, and D? Rather than the editor saying, well, I think some of the criticisms raised by reviewer A are important. Why don't you address these? These, I as editor don't think are significant criticisms. So if you want to address them or not, that's up to you. And I think having active scientific involvement means that the editors are more willing to focus on the science, not what other people are saying. And that's really important.
Mhm.
All right. So what role does multiple collaborations play in strengthening the impact of research? Like if one particular paper comes out of from collaborative study where there are more than even 2 groups involved in the publication, and how does it impact the quality of research or the paper itself?
Are you asking how do collaborative papers improve the quality of the paper, or are you asking?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm
Because
asking.
I wasn't sure if you meant multiple papers on the same topic. So yeah, well, I think it goes back to something we talked about earlier, Jarnell, which is a lot of cooks in the kitchen, contrary to the common saying, often make the meal better, right?
Mhm.
And I think, I've been very lucky to collaborate with people like Andy and, and get feedback from people like Anna and collaborating with Brandon, people who are really different from me, who have very, very different backgrounds, very different skill sets, very different philosophies that they've learned through their training. And I have, through those collaborations, learned more than in any other aspect of my career about how to do science. So I think, if you're an observant person, I think all of us are, being scientists, you watch your collaborators, you watch what they do, you watch how they do it, you learn from it. And I think science now is multidisciplinary. It's strengthened by multiple different approaches, by looking, taking the problem and turning it in your hand and asking different questions. And those are exciting, but I think they're also seen as powerful studies. And so I think having collaborative work is wonderful. That said, it's really nice just working with one other writer as well. That's just as stimulating, I think. More focused. Some studies are just meant to be more simplistic. They don't need a lot of different approaches, and they're fine too. I think there are many great single author publications, and I'll just say one other advantage to collaboration is that in some cases, having an additional senior person on a paper, if you're a trainee, can be really helpful for your training, because they may offer a different set of inputs than your mentor. In some cases, they may be more attentive to things than your mentor. They may influence your mentor to move things along more quickly. That's sort of, it can also be a detriment. You can have collaborators who never respond to your emails, right? So it can work in both ways. But I don't know if that gets to the question, but that's what comes to my mind.
Yeah, I think the idea that for a lot of science, with all the new techniques that are coming into our field and other fields, it can be very hard for one lab to do everything. In fact, I would say most of the time it's probably impossible. And so what I would call the sort of experimental collaborations, where you bring together a team using different techniques to approach a problem or different skill sets, is really important. But I think also, and that is becoming, it's becoming much more common. The NIH recognizes it. They talk about the importance of team science a lot. And, in terms of, grant review, that's something that they want to emphasize. my own university has team science as one of the criteria for promotion and advancement of the faculty, so that we encourage faculty to collaborate together rather than penalizing them. And I think that is a shift in the sort of culture of American science that has happened, over the last 15 years or so. And I think that's a healthy one. It is, historically, it was hard for many young faculty to succeed simply because they were either scared to collaborate with each other or to collaborate with more senior colleagues for fear that they would be seen as not being truly independent. And I don't have any time for that argument at all. And I'm glad that things are changing for the better. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of collaborations that can be beneficial are what I would term long-term collaborations. And I certainly in my career, I have benefited greatly from publishing papers with my very good friend and former colleague, Neil Siegel. So when I started my first faculty position in Los Angeles, and I was interviewing there, I will be honest and say that Neil was not one of the people I thought I would be collaborating with when I went there. And after joining, within a very short period of time, I suddenly realized that we had a huge amount in common, and both of us, our research program sort of morphed to take account of the other partner in this collaboration. And it's a collaboration that has gone on for the last 20 years. Our most recent paper that we were both authors on came out just a few months ago. And I'm currently revising another paper that's hopefully going to be published later this year. And I think identifying sort of scientific soulmates who you collaborate with, not just experimentally and technically, but also sort of intellectually, if you can find people like that, whether they are just down the corridor from you or they're on the other side of the world, that can be a really wonderful thing if you can find it and keep it. And I would encourage people to look for those opportunities as they develop their careers.
Yeah, so collaborations are like really helpful, particularly because the field is like multidisciplinary and you need several new techniques which your lab can perform, or you have the equipment facility for that.
As Jenny says, there are some collaborators who are a pain in the butt, right? You bring someone onto a project because you need a particular, technique done, or you need a particular line of mice, and they can just be a pain in the butt to work with from beginning to end. And I'm just going to leave it there. But I think understanding those dynamics and being able to look out for those sort of red flags in the future can also help you as you build collaborations going forward. My attitude, I tell people in my lab, I always give a collaborator one chance to misbehave. Because you have to start off somewhere. But it's really important that if you're going to build long-term collaborative relationships, it's with people that you are, scientifically suited to, that your temperaments work well, your labs work well together, and there's just none of the drama that, can make that kind of thing a pain.
I'll just since we're talking about publications, I think something else that comes to mind is it's really nice to have someone to strategize with when you have a challenge. And we do all have challenges, right? We have reviews we have to make decisions about. And a lot of times I'll have a first impression when I see a review, and I'll think, I've got to do like 3 months worth of experiments. And I'll talk to my collaborator and she'll say, I think we can do this and this instead. And it's a wonderful partnership that way around the publication process. I feel like there are a lot of issues to do with publishing that we may not have touched on. Do people have questions? We have 15 minutes left, right?
Yeah, for
Uh,
before break we have 15 minutes left.
Okay. Any topics that we haven't really touched on that have been challenging to you in the group here?
So another thing is like how to maintain balance of like praise and critics while considering your own biases. Like you believe in certain idea and you think like, oh, this is the best one and I want to pursue this, and you are emphasizing on that in your publication, but your reviewer says doesn't like that idea or something like that, and then
Well, so
like
one of my mentors was one of my best mentors over the years has been my former postdoc mentor, Marianne Bronner, who has been the editor of a number of different scientific journals over the years. And something she taught me early on when I was in her lab is that publishing and getting a paper accepted is a negotiation with the reviewers. And when the process works well, an author or a set of authors won't necessarily have addressed every single, detailed point and conceptual, viewpoint that the reviewers want, but they have made a good faith effort to address the most significant concerns. And I think in terms of, rebutting reviewers' comments, you have to bear that negotiation idea in mind. It's like, don't go into this firstly being angry with the reviewers and, coming up with ways to angrily dismiss their concerns. Really be honest with yourself about, okay, they have identified some flaws here. We can fix these. We will address these, and obviously we'll clear up the small minor points and mislabeled figures that they very helpfully identify for us. But do view it as a negotiation, that you don't have to, completely transform your paper into something else just because the reviewer wants you to. They can publish their own papers on it, on a similar topic, and they can have their own ideas. But be reasonable in your rebuttals, and view that, if you view the process as a negotiation rather than an ordeal, it can be more productive.
I don't have much to add to that.
okay. So another thing is like to improve the field, like a well-written discussion of the paper, which is very important. Like how does it help improve the field?
How does a discussion help improve the field?
Yeah. Means,
Yeah.
go ahead, please.
Well, a well-written discussion is, takes into consideration the findings of the paper, obviously, but extends that extends it to, inspire new studies in the field, to reflect on how it impacts prior findings and expands prior findings. I think it has to be humble. One cannot overinterpret one's results. I think it's really important to put them into the context of other people's findings and acknowledge other people's contributions. We're all moving slowly, almost, like a mass through our publications, advancing our work. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that our work is adding on top of other people's, and then also, considering limitations. So I'm just I'm puzzled by this because I think discussions are one place in which a lot of us, like, there's more continuity in discussions than any other aspect of papers, I find. I think we're all we're all sort of pretty aware of how to discuss our data. I think it's a lot harder to introduce the data, introduce a problem in a succinct way than interpret it. But I guess I'm not totally sure what it'd be helpful to know if someone had a particular challenge with the discussion, what that was. But what do you think, Andy? I mean, you're muted.
Here we go. I think being honest about the limitations of your study, whether they are technical limitations or, just some experiments just aren't possible to do right now, I think is important. And I think acknowledging those limitations up front can actually, in some cases, protect you from, to some extent, from some of the comments or challenges that reviewers might level at your study. And sometimes I refer to that as a pre-buttal rather than a rebuttal. You try and anticipate some of the criticisms that may come at your study, criticisms that right now you are not in a position to address, but nevertheless discuss them in a mature and sensible way. I think also acknowledging inconsistencies or current inconsistencies between what you have found and other published studies over the years can also be important if you acknowledge and then suggest reasons why that may be the case. And I think sometimes the field can make a lot of progress by heightening or understanding those sort of seeming paradoxes or contradictions that can actually be a fruitful avenue of research for the future as well. Mm-hmm. So I think acknowledging the limitations of your own study, but also seeing how the work that you're doing may, not in your study, but in future studies, resolve future questions can also be really helpful. One of the, again, not wanting to beat on journals too much, one of the things that sometimes is a shame is the increasing pressure on journals, the journals place on authors to condense their papers into a certain number of words. Mm-hmm. And I think that pressure can sometimes lead people to ignore all these discussions of the limitations of their studies and how it relates to other things in the field and just focus on the big impact story. And I think that's a shame. Mm-hmm. I think there is room for papers, for research papers, experimental papers that nevertheless have a nice, mature discussion of the strengths and weaknesses, not only of your studies, but other studies too. And I think it's becoming harder to squeeze those into journal articles now. And review articles too, which could theoretically be a place to sort of discuss things. But again, it's hard to do that. Mm-hmm.
Some people in their research articles exaggerate about their research findings, and they might say about like, hey, I have done this and this might have translation potential or talk about something like that, but they didn't do any functional study or for that particular drug or whatever, like could have impact on hair cells or some other cell types. And still they talk about those things, like how to avoid those exaggerations, like besides like journals are most of the journals are like peer reviewed.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry. Do you?
So like from the results, they conclude something big.
So they overinterpret, they
misinterpret their results or studies.
Yeah, well, one hopes the reviewers are observant of that and provide some feedback. One hopes that, your co-authors can dampen the overinterpretations as you had them read them. I think we're all guilty of that. I think because we think really simplistically about our work as we're doing it. Okay, check that box. I got that result. And when it comes to the point of really making conclusions, one has to step back out and look at the whole broad field and ask, how does my conclusion fit into the big picture, and what can I really conclude with certainty based on the design of my study, etc. So you see it all the time, though. I mean, there are lots of papers in our field that in some ways seem too good to be true, or have misleading titles, as Andy said, sensational titles, and I guess I think I try to remind myself that my peers have good intentions when they write a paper. They're under the same pressure as I am, and they may not have had the really constructive feedback I've had, and they may not have had the fortune of asking the right people, or they may not have been smart enough to ask the right people to give them criticisms. And they all may also be under pressure to publish in high impact journals that like these kind of sensational results, and when Andy was speaking about, impact factor, one of my thoughts was, well, it's not a rule that all the best papers have the highest impact factor, right?
Yes.
I think a lot of people are pushed to overinterpret because they're pushed for sensation, and I think it's really important to talk yourself back from that and really remind yourself what our jobs are, what your job is, which is to, provide information that's reliable to the public, so the public can replicate it, can use it to build new information, can rely on it, right? I mean, one of the things that we're pushed now in grants to do is to talk specifically about rigor and reproducibility. And this is, those are the hallmarks of reliable research. So I'm judgmental of papers that overinterpret their data, but I'm also somewhat sympathetic because I know they're under pressure sometimes to oversell things, so to speak. So I'm always trying to check myself on that. Just be careful.
I have these discussions with my colleagues from time to time. I believe it is a fact that the rate of retraction of papers is greater in higher impact journals than in lower impact journals. And certainly I think all of us can think of examples of very high profile papers in very high profile journals that were retracted, sometimes under tragic circumstances. And the thing is, I'm not sure whether that is just because there is a pressure to, overinterpret and, and boost a paper to get it into these journals, or whether it is simply the fact that being a high impact, high profile journal, there are more pairs of eyes on the paper, and therefore a greater opportunity to identify things that might not be altogether correct. I want to believe, I don't want to believe that, because what that would mean is that there are lots and lots of studies in journals of all kinds of impact factors that actually have suspect data in them. And I really don't want to believe that. I don't want to believe that it's just the high profile ones that end up getting retracted. But I think there is definitely the temptation, both on the part of authors and on the part of journals, to publish, novel, revolutionary, high impact, very sexy discoveries and then clean up the mess later. And I think that's a real shame.
So I have already asked most of the questions that were on the top of my head so far. So do you, Andy and Jenny, do you think did I miss something like that needs to be discussed? And it's very important for this session.
I don't know. I want to hear from the trainees.
Yeah, there is not even a single question.
I mean, I can blather on about stuff, you know, for a while, but I'd like this to be helpful to people. So
I can ask something.
okay, Beatrice.
Hi, I'm a postdoc in Matt Kelly's lab, and I was listening to the beginning of the session while driving around my car, looking for COVID tests because I had a recent COVID scare. So that's my day. Anyway, I have been thinking about writing a lot because we all do. And something that I like to ask established academics is sort of to describe how their writing habits have changed over the years. You know, like everybody has a particular formula, but I just wonder, I still feel often as a trainee that I still haven't hit my rhythm or haven't found exactly what the formula is for me. And so I'm just sort of trying to explore parameter space here and see if there's something that I'm missing with making writing easier and faster and feeling efficient and overall better.
I'll let Andy go first. Why don't we change the order up?
So I know this is a cliche, but it's much, much easier to rewrite than to write. So, you know, when you have that scary white screen in front of you, write something, okay, and then rewrite it. So just in terms of a technical, you know, being intimidated by getting started or by being productive, I think rewriting is much, much easier. I think, you know, you could have like a week-long seminar on how to structure papers, but people go about this in different ways. Some people start off with the figures, some people start off with the figure legends, or rather the title of the figures, using those as bullet points to structure the flow of the paper. Other people like to just start writing like summary paragraphs of what each part of the paper is going to show. Some people like to do the introduction of when they are starting to write the paper. Other people like to leave it to the end because they then know how to sort of position the introduction to fairly and comprehensively deal with what's going to come in the paper. I don't think there's any one perfect way of doing this. I think and also different strategies work for different mentor-mentee or different collaborator combinations. Some people work really well when they're given a bunch of figures that they can start, you know, putting together and threading into a story. Other people like to have the ideas down first without really even thinking about the data. Whatever works for you, your mentor and your collaborator, I think is important. In terms of the physical act of writing itself, I mean, it sounds so obvious, and I think people do say it, and it does sound obvious. The key to clear writing is to know what you want to say. You know, whether that's in like an entire review article or whether it's just in a paragraph. And I think a lot of the writing that I correct from people in my lab is that the paragraphs sort of go around in this sort of like, not circular, but it's circular going to a point. It's like the point is made several times redundantly. And just be clear about what you want to say. And that can be really hard. And that can be really hard in science. I do the same thing for my students and postdocs when they're doing PowerPoint presentations. It's like they put up a slide and it's like, what's the message here? And I think both for talks and for papers, I think the data is the what. You know, the paper itself or the title of the paper or the title of sections or the title of figures is the so what. You're sort of indicating why it's important and the point that it's making. And I think that also goes back to, the tendency that some people want to have to just put all the data in there and not really make these triage decisions about what data belongs and what data doesn't. So that's a very long-winded answer. I don't know if I had answered your question adequately.
Yeah, it's tough. I don't think I've mastered it either yet, B. I used to start by taking my posters apart and just putting them into a paper form. Like that was a really easy way to kind of cheat, because I get the posters to a point where the study was almost all together, right? And then I could put it in, and I could sort of begin to see the structure in the paper and then fill it in. I'll give you a couple tricks, but I will tell you, in all honesty, I write whatever section I feel like writing on a given day. I will save the materials and methods to the very end. I can't stand writing them. Okay. So it just has to do with, it needs to be a fun process, And so I've always I haven't been that disciplined. And one trick I have is, I like to write results first. Okay. I think that makes the most sense to me. And I'll take, as I'm writing results, I'll often begin to start to write a discussion, right? And at that moment, I capture that and bring it down to the end of my paper. And I keep doing that reiteratively. Whenever I have something that I think is a point I want to make about the results, I'll bring it down and I'll start this massive dump at the bottom of my paper, which is my discussion. And then once I'm done with my results, right, I will move into that section. But my favorite part is writing the intro. So I'll kind of do that, savor it for when I want to. But most of my papers take incredibly long to write. I think they're done and they're not. I end up writing 2 more figures. I end up taking this figure out. I end up, it's an incredibly reiterative and long, torturous process. And I don't know how to make it any different. I think I've failed at that, but I will say I enjoy it. And so I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing so that I keep writing, because I like the process and it works for me. I will say a couple other things, and we haven't talked about this yet, but journal clubs are super important, because that's your place to look at lots of different writing styles, really actively observe the different styles, the way in which people present an argument. How do they transition through their different sections, right? How do they get you interested? How do they summarize what they just showed you and lead that into what the next question is, right? Through the results section, for instance. That's an art, and I think you can learn a lot by reading a lot of papers. And of course, right, journal clubs are really important for evaluating data presentation. How interpretable was that graph, right? How clear was the caption? How digestible was that image? Could I understand it? And so by actively reading other people's grants, not just to learn what they found, but to understand how they presented it, is probably the best lesson for how to write a good paper.
I appreciate the acknowledgement that it's still hard for you, Jenny. I think that's it's really nice and normalizing to hear that, because actually I don't think that it's the writing itself that is often the problem for me, at least. Like, I consider myself a strong writer. I think the problem for me is more just all the feelings around it, right? Because when we're writing these papers, it's more than just the act of writing a science paper. It's all of the feelings that come around, the pressure to do it, and there's the deadline, and do I have all the data I need yet? And so I think that cutting through that cloud is probably my main issue, rather than the writing itself.
I think that's quite common. Yeah. It's kind of unfortunate that the sort of the last thing that we do before we're finishing a study is one of the hardest, right? It's like the first thing we do in writing a grant is the hardest, and the last thing we do is the hardest, I think. And yet those should be things that we relish, but they're really intellectually and emotionally challenging.
One thing that I have changed over the years is when I seek the advice of other people who are not part of the study, when I seek their advice on a paper. And back in the day, I used to wait until the paper was basically done, and then I would show it to colleagues and ask for their feedback. And the more colleagues I would show it to, the longer it would take me to, address all their concerns and then get the paper out. And then I would have to deal with the reviewers. And so one thing I have tended to do more over the years is to sort of talk to colleagues and ask their advice as the study is ongoing, rather than at the end when the paper is written and the figures are done. I'm just going to say this. I've had, Neil and me have published a whole bunch of papers together. And one of the things I said years ago that shocked him, when I had sort of had this moment of realization, and we were arguing about whether to send the final version of the paper out to some people to look at. And I said, finally, Neil, I don't care what these people say about the paper. The only people I care about right now are the reviewers. And we're not going to share it with them for their comments and feedback. We're going to send it to them, when we submit the paper. And he was like scandalized. But when I sort of stepped back and said, maybe what we want to do is involve these people earlier on. And so you don't have to do major surgery on a finished product at the end. That might be better. Now, I don't want to sound too strident or dogmatic about this. We do show our manuscripts to other people at some late stages, but I try and move that process earlier in terms of getting feedback about the study.
What's your advice on making balance of doing research, people who do bench work versus devoting time for writing publications?
You mean with trainees?
With postdoc trainees?
Yeah. So again, I am dating myself. So I did my PhD, and I would say at least my first postdoc in labs where computers weren't easily available during the day. And if they were connected to a piece of equipment. And they didn't have word processing programs on them. So I did all my writing in the evenings and at weekends, but that was because I had to. I didn't have a laptop. If I was going to write at my desk during the day, it was going to be on a piece of paper. As a trainee, I was basically doing that, writing at home, writing in the evenings. Now, since becoming a PI, where I have so many different demands on my time, one of the skills that I have learned is that I can write in 5 or 10 minute bursts. So when I started off, I needed to, have a long period of time to write. And it's not like I will write an entire paper in 5 or 10 minute stretches, but often if I have like 10 or 15 minutes between one meeting and another, and I have a chance to do some writing, I make a very quick decision about, okay, what can I do? Can I, edit the materials and methods of this bit of the paper in the next 10 minutes? Yes, I can. Okay, I'm going to do that. Or am I going to edit the figure legends, or am I going to write the figure legend for this figure? Yeah, I'm going to do that. I got 10 minutes, bang. And so using time pressure to sort of make you write something, knowing that you can edit that later, I think that's an important skill for a multitasking person as they advance, through their career, when you have phone calls and Zoom meetings and people banging on your door and so on. It's like, use the time you have and learn to use it productively.
That's great, Andy. I mean, I think the fact you can do that, I think, is almost a revelation to me. And I have never tried it myself, but it does relieve a lot of pressure from the writing process. If you can just kind of eke it out in 10-minute intervals. I know not everything, right? Not the discussion. It's probably pretty hard to do that, but I'll go back to the thing that I think we should all consider, which is what's most enjoyable for you, what suits your personality. For me, the first 3 hours of the day I get up are my best writing hours. So I really like to get up early and crank on something before the house gets busy. You know, I don't think there is a best way. I think there's a best way for you. So I think one of the best things about our career, it's an amazing career, right? Is that we can make these choices. We can decide if we want to pour the gel, or we want to go to the confocal, or we want to, you know, talk with our peers, or write or read papers. It's an amazingly rich career, and you know, there's no formula for what works. Just do what feels best and most enjoyable, and that's probably fine.
Thank you. Did anyone ask any question?
So I'd like to ask a question. Someone have a question? Did you say that? I want to pose a question about, I'm going to pose this to Andy. It may not be fair to me for me to do this, but I think this is something that comes up a lot, and I think it's a difficult question for trainees to pose. But I'm going to do it. What happens if you're writing a paper and you're really motivated to get this paper completed, but your PI is sitting on it? Or vice versa, for that matter. How do we motivate people to have the same values and pressure around a paper that we have? What's good communication strategy for that?
Yeah. I can say, as the director of the grad program, and across our grad school in general, one of the complaints of students, and I'm sure it is a complaint of postdoc trainees too, is that my PI is sitting on my paper. And I just don't get it. It's not something that I do. You know, I want to get papers out as soon as possible. And I just don't understand it in terms of how to get on the radar screen of a recalcitrant PI who is sitting on a paper and not doing anything. If I had a magic bullet, I would have a whole bunch more happy grad students in our grad school. You know, just getting in their face, offering to do stuff, offering to rewrite it, offering to do figures, offering to do something. I don't have any better solutions for that. I think, looking at it the other way around, I think trainees obviously have a responsibility to publish their work. I think, you know, what we've done in our grad school by making a first author paper mandatory for graduation is a motivating factor to get people, you know, writing and producing their papers. You know, telling people that this is a training experience. If you're going to advance in science, whether it's the postdoc PI route, or whether you're going to go into industry, whether you're going to go into, you know, scientific communication or public policy, whether you're going to use your science PhD for anything related to science, you've got to get into the habit of being productive and writing and getting your ideas down. And this is all a training experience for you. It isn't just an ordeal that you have to go through. And if people don't like that, then it's going to be very hard for them to find a science career where they're going to be absolved of the need to do that kind of writing. So you have to learn to love some aspects of it at least.
Yeah. Make a pact with your co-writers. They may like some sections to write better than you do, right?
That's absolutely true. Some people love materials and methods writing. Other people hate it because it's too picky. Absolutely. You know, some people love writing figure legends. Some people have a thing about reference manager programs. And you know, they will try the latest thing, and, you know, more power to them if it works.
Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
really hard for trainees to feel comfortable pushing their mentors and their co-writers. And as a mentor, I really appreciate it when a trainee says to me, I've been waiting for your response, and you know, I'm it's frustrated. I think someone needs to mute a little bit in competing. You know, it means a lot to me to get this paper out, and I know you've been really busy, but if there's any way you can, in the next week, get me something back, I would be so appreciative. Like, I like it when people do that, because like Andy said, we have a lot of things we're managing administratively, particularly, that are very distracting, and I will lose touch. I'll lose track of what's going on sometimes. And I just need people to remind me, you know, to get my priorities back in straight and into a good position, good order. So I, you know, you can say it in different ways. I call it managing your manager, which is a little, you know, this is what Ed Rubel taught me. I used to go into his office, knock on his door and say, I'm sorry, Ed, but I have something to add. And he's like, come in, don't apologize. This is what your job is. Tell me what I need to do. And so that's how I feel too. Oh, can I ask another question? Maybe some of you from the audience can answer this. One of the important aspects of writing and submitting a paper is writing a cover letter. How do you write an effective cover letter? What are some of the elements that should go into that? What is the editor gleaning from your cover letter? It's the purpose of it.
I can say something. So hi everyone. I'm Shachar. I'm from David Sprinza Club in Tel Aviv University, and it's the middle of the night here in Israel.
Oh,
so,
thank you for being here.
Thank you. It was really interesting. So I'm actually at my first steps at the academic world. I'm a first year PhD student. So I only wrote one paper, but when we wrote the cover letter, so I wrote the first version. I tried to broadly frame the research as best as I could and try to make it appealing to the editor. And then I sent it to my advisor, and the version I got back was like completely different. When I read read my version after writing it, it was like, sounds kind of interesting. When I read my advisor version, and it's the same research, I thought like, wow, this is a great research. I want to read about it. So I don't know, it's kind of a magic, I guess you learn with the years how to frame things so they sound really, really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have the same reaction when I send my first draft of a cover letter to my co-authors and they send it back and it's much better. It's a challenge. Andy, since you edit, how do you use a cover letter? How do the editors typically, what are they trying to glean from the cover letter?
Well, so I just, to be clear, I am not an academic editor for any of the journals. I'm just on the editorial board. So I don't usually get to see cover letters. I used to be an editor for scientific reports. And there, really, because of the criteria that scientific reports place on their publications, that basically the criteria for acceptance is that they have to be technically sound. The only thing I would read the cover letter for was suggested reviewers. So I don't have any bigger insights on that. For better or worse, I have never been terribly good at writing cover letters. I think I just sort of, summarize, we'd like to send it to your journal. This is what the findings of the paper are. This is why we think it's important, and sort of trying to do that as concisely as possible. I have heard, some people like to send like pre-publication or pre-submission inquiries to journals. And everything I've heard from journal editors over the years is that they hate those, and that it's impossible really for a journal editor to decide whether they're going to review a paper without actually seeing the paper. And so I know people have different opinions on this, but my advice would be, don't waste time with pre-submission inquiries, just send the paper out. And if you think your paper should go to a high-profile journal, then be prepared for a bout of speed dating, because it will probably get rejected by a couple of journals, and you'll send it to the next one. And don't take it personally. Just get on and get the paper out. But honestly, if a journal makes a decision about the value of a paper based on the cover letter, you might want to ask yourself whether you want to be publishing in that journal.
Okay, that's one perspective.
That is an extreme perspective, I would say, but
yeah, I think, most of them require it. So I think the important thing is to be concise. They don't want to read a long letter. So Andy said 3 short paragraphs. That's great. And just get, like you were saying, Shahar, just get the point across of what you found and why it's novel, why it's impactful and significant in the field. And I do think considering your readership is really important. The readership of that journal, how you tailor your cover letter is going to depend on how you're tailoring your paper to that readership. If you're, and this is something we really haven't talked about, but if you're working on cochlear implant outcomes or something like that, or some other topic that's pretty specific to hearing, then you don't have to really write a carefully composed letter to hearing research for your paper. If you're trying to get that paper into the Journal of Neuroscience, you're going to have a bigger challenge, because you really have to put the paper into the context of that journal. And as Andy said, there aren't a lot of papers that use that for screening, but I personally think you'll gain some graces of the editor if you write a good cover letter and explain why it belongs in that journal.
The other thing to bear in mind is that the reviewers don't get to see the cover letter. They just get to see the paper. So, it doesn't matter how spectacular the cover letter is once it goes through the review process, because people will decide how good your paper is on the strength of the paper.
Mm-hmm. But sometimes in writing the cover letter, you'll figure out something that needs to go into your introduction.
That's fair.
Because you put a different hat on, and then you realize, oh, wow, I hadn't thought about this point, so I'm going to add it.
Yeah. I think sometimes if you want to advocate for your paper to a journal with a broader readership, and I think, as Jenny says, in the hearing field, this can be a challenge sometimes. I think having explicit statements of why you think your study is going to be of interest to a more general readership, to people who don't just work on cochlear implants or, whatever, I think can be helpful. But obviously, as Jenny says, for like hearing research or JARO, that probably isn't necessary.
All right. We have a question from audience. How many papers should a postdoc trainee publish during postdoc training? Some people say if we don't publish 1 paper per year as postdoc co-author, then a review article would be an alternative.
Andy, you want to take that one to start?
I don't think there's a magic number. I think it depends on the project. I think steady publication is a good thing. And, there are so many ways of approaching that. Sometimes when a postdoc joins a lab, they will have the opportunity to participate in collaborative projects with other people while they're learning the techniques in the lab, and that can help them get like a middle author paper out. Certainly writing review articles with their mentor can also be a great way of getting familiar with a field and the literature in it while you're sort of starting to get up and running. One thing my lab did during the COVID shutdown in 2020, we got 3 review articles out because people were stuck at home for a couple of months and they didn't have anything to do other than analyze their data. So we started writing reviews. I also used that time and got a bunch of my friends and colleagues around the world, including Jenny, to contribute to a book of protocols that I was putting together. So that was another thing to do. But there are ways of getting sort of on the publishing treadmill without necessarily thinking, oh my God, I've just started my postdoc. I have to have the first author paper in the next 18 months. So I think there isn't a magic formula, but there are ways of being productive.
Yeah, I think, if I were going to be, what I'd be more interested in is, has that individual developed a knowledge and a mastery of the topic they're working on, such that they've published substantial papers in that area. I think 5 years, if someone was in the postdoc for 5 years and they published 3 great papers, I think that'd be fantastic. Mm-hmm. That's probably what I did. And I think if one's thinking about, should I write a research paper to fill in this year? You need to think really hard about that personally. If it's going to detract from getting out a great, if you want to write a review paper, if it's going to detract from writing a great research paper the following year, I may not do it. I think you just have to think about the time available. I do admit that when I'm looking at CVs or bio sketches or something for grants, I'll look at continuity and I'll sort of look for gap years, but I really don't put too much, I don't put too much in there. If a graduate student publishes 3 papers and a postdoc publishes 3 or 4 papers, to me, that's good productivity. But what's more important is that they have sort of adopted something that they can carry into their own. So they've sort of mastered something during that time that they're there. They don't even necessarily need to carry it on. It's just that they've become an expert in that field such that they have published some meaningful work in it.
Well, and I would say also the sort of relevance of a paper that someone is on that has 25 other authors compared to one where there are 2 or 3 other authors. I think people are capable of making judgments about, the amount of work, the amount of independence that someone contributed towards that particular study. I think Jenny's point about timing is important as well. And I would say this about postdocs, just as I said it about PIs a little while ago, that, I have been on search committees where we will have applicants from, very good labs around the world applying to be faculty at my institution. And you look at their CD and they have gone for 8 years without publishing anything as a postdoc. And then they had a Nature article, and it's a fantastic Nature article. And, it's going to advance the field forward, but I can promise you that on search committees, it will inevitably come up. Well, look, if we hire this guy, are we going to be waiting for another 8 years for the next paper to come along? And there are many search committees that aren't willing to take that bet. And so again, I think, showing that you can get the job done consistently is important.
There is one more question, similar question about what about non-primary research articles that are targeted to trainees such as J Neurosciences, Journal Club, or Journal of Neurophysiology, Neuroform, spARO's research news highlights for JRO? Do you think these are worthwhile, or are there other options like these, like which postdocs or trainees can pursue?
I will say from a sort of hiring and advancement point of view, I think obviously I would not place as much weight on those as I would on primary research articles. Nevertheless, in terms of experience in writing itself, I think those can be worthwhile. So as long as it's not distracting you from, the main business of doing the experiments and writing the papers, I think that's fine if it's helping you become a better writer. I think something else that we haven't touched on yet, but obviously the flip side of all this is reviewing. And I think working with your mentor, if you have the opportunity to participate in the review of research papers, is a good thing. Journals are completely on board with this. So, anytime you review for a journal, they always ask you now, did someone else help you with the review? What was their name? What role did they do in the review? So it's completely fine to do that. And it's a valuable training exercise. And often what people do is, the trainee will read the paper and make their comments on it, and then the mentor will do the same. And then you come together and compare your notes, and you can get a sense then from seeing how your mentor thinks about papers, what they feel is important, what they feel is less important, but, maybe still worth bringing up. And I think, again, as a training experience, that's really valuable. I was, again, fortunate as when I was, for my second postdoc, I was with Marianne Bronner, who was the editor of a number of journals. And so rather than reviewing manuscripts with me, she would actually assign me manuscripts to review myself as the primary reviewer. Not many, but it was, again, a way of getting me going in reviewing papers. And I would discuss them with her, but they were basically my review. But that is really important too. Seeing the process from the other side of the submission and review side is really important.
Yeah, some journals do allow like lab PI staff to also contribute to
I think most journals do that now.
And even if someone is like new to the review process, like new reviewer, then they encourage you to take help from your seniors for reviewing the particular article, and that's fantastic. Sometimes some people have like authorship issues in a lab, or when they are like working in a collaborative project and they come up with like, oh, I was supposed to be the first author or second author in this publication, but I got 6th or 5th number in the paper, although they got authorship, but they are not satisfied with that. Like, how to maintain that? Like, how do you decide while managing lab group? Like, who is going to be the first author? Who is going to be the like co-authors on that particular paper?
Yeah, I don't think there's a golden rule for this, but I think it's pretty common. First of all, I think it's very wise that when you're embarking on a study that you have this discussion at that point. However, and in my lab, primary authors write the paper, right? They've done most of the work and they write the paper, and that's typically how it goes. But it's not uncommon in my case, because I have a lot of 1-year-long otolaryngology residents in the lab. They come in the lab and they work for a year, and studies don't get done in a year, right? And so someone else needs
to take over that.
Yeah. And that's when it becomes challenging. And so I try to, when they're transitioning out, I have a pretty frank conversation and say, there's going to be, Kelly's coming in and she's going to take this, and we're going to assess things as we go along. And ultimately, right, the paper's not written at that point, and there's a lot to be determined. It is, I understand it's a very sensitive issue, because I think some people feel that first or second authorships as trainees are really the most important ones. But I think also sometimes trainees, particularly residents who are kind of short-term, don't really understand how much work goes into a paper. So like my papers take anywhere between 3 and 4 years to finish, you know. And so I think they're often disillusioned and surprised when it takes so long for a paper to get out. And so I think for PIs, it's really important to be transparent about this at the beginning. And I think for resident or for trainees, I think that's fair game for questions. You know, how do you envision at this point the authorship's going to look? You know, and what does it take? What would make me eligible to be the first author on this? And you know, another option, what's happening with these papers I just referenced, is we're going to have a couple of co-primary authors, and that's pretty common. And I think that's fine. But no, it's a tricky subject, and things morph in ways you don't anticipate. So I think being transparent all the way along is the most important thing.
Yeah, I think a good rule of thumb is to have at least 3 discussions about authorship. You know, one at the outset of a study in terms of thinking who might do the work. During the process, as data is being collected and you see how maybe the study is changing and you're relying more on one person or another to generate particular data. And then obviously as the paper is being written and finalized, it's important to return to the order of authorship, and also making decisions about whether someone belongs on the author list or in the acknowledgements. I think the Society for Neuroscience has a really good set of guidelines on authorship that I recommend people reading. I think they're some of the most thoughtful in terms of authorship and credit. I make people in my lab, as they're working on a study, to keep track of what it is they've done on the study. So, you know, what experiments they did, you know, if there's a given figure, you know, how their data contributed to that. So we have a tally of it. And often when you get all those things, you can see that in some areas, you know, there may be either confusion or conflict that 2 people think they did the same experiment. It doesn't happen very often. But I think that's very important. It's also really important when you're collaborating with another lab to have an idea, because you can't see who is doing what in the other lab, you know, whether it's down the corridor or on the other side of the world. And so I think encouraging collaborators to do the same thing can be very helpful too. You know, in terms of assigning priority. And honestly, once you get above 5 or 6 authors, it can become really hard to decide who's going to be 9th versus 10th. You know, some people will do things they'll do like the first author and the last author, and everyone else is alphabetical. I know from experience, from having seen other people do that, that's really unpopular. You know, especially people whose last name begins with C. So I don't think that's a good idea. But yeah, it is difficult. But I think being open about and being clear about what you contributed and documenting that is important. The other thing, and I am guilty of this, sometimes PIs forget who did what. And so it can be instructive to get people in your lab to compile their lists of how they contributed to the paper. And then you do your own as a PI and compare your list with theirs. And it can sometimes be chastening as a PI, especially for a long study where you may have lost track of who did what. So I think involving people in that process and being open about this is a process we're all going to be involved in and it's going to help everyone can be important.
Anna, you wanted to state something.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention, besides the Journal of Neuroscience guidelines, there are, in addition, NIH guidelines, and those can be used to kind of settle debates or as a trainee, I had a former trainee who went to a clinical department, and his clinical head decided that he, the head, would be an author on everybody's paper in the whole department. And so my former trainee was, uncertain what to do with this. And I suggested he download the NIH guidelines and show it to his department head and say, that's actually not a thing.
Mhm.
That doesn't count as a contribution.
Good point. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful
Mhm.
to make decisions.
Yeah, I think the honorary authorship, as they call it, is becoming less common, but it hasn't disappeared completely. And yeah, that's just not on. But as Anna says, fortunately, there are policies against that now.
Mhm.
All right, it's time to conclude the session. And I would like to thank our both speakers, Andy and Jenny, for their valuable suggestions and thoughtful comments and do's and do notes for good publications. And I would also like to thank organizer to give me the opportunity to moderate this session. And at last, I would also like to thank all the audience and their questions. Thank you so much.
Sure. And I would just add, so thanks, Janelle, for moderating this. But if any of you guys have questions that you would like to take up offline, then please feel free to email me. I'll be happy to.
Thank you so much.
Address them. So,
Thank
best
you.
of
Nice
luck,
to
everyone.
see you. Yes, best of luck. Thanks, B, for your help as well. And this is a really helpful and great set of sessions that spARO is putting on. So well done.